I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West. Welcome to our talk tonight on the hidden STEM economy. It's going to hear a lot of, we think, interesting and important information. I always like to remind myself to tell you that the PowerPoint is in fact already up on our website. So don't go too crazy trying to take notes if it's beyond your physical capability as Jonathan goes through his slides here. If you click on the Brookings Mountain West website and our lecture series and look at past lectures, you'll already see his PowerPoint, and the video will be up in a few days as well. This is very good timing for this talk. Some of you may have seen that UNLV announced today that it received it was the lead institution among 13 universities in the Intermountain West. It's just received a $20.3 million grant directed at health and clinical research in the region. So we appreciate their timing on that to coincide with Jonathan's lecture. Tell you a little bit about Jonathan. He's a senior research associate at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, has his undergraduate degree from Penn State, a master's from the New School, his PhD's from Penn State, and he's going to walk us through this hidden STEM economy and what it means both locally. He has some interesting local data as well as a national perspective on it. And like our scholars, he's been here all week in this case. He's been in classes, he's met with some students, and he may even have a few comments on that as we proceed. I'll be back when Jonathan's through to help with the Q&A part of the program. So have your questions ready. Jonathan?
Thank you, Bill. It's been a great few days so far, and I want to thank Bill Brown, the folks at Brookings Mountain West, and UNLV for being great hosts. So this evening I'm going to be telling you about the STEM labor force. Before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. We're one of the newer divisions within Brookings, and our research focuses on looking at how national issues of economic and social importance play out in metropolitan areas. And one of the reasons we focus on metropolitan areas is not only because that's where most of the population lives, 85% of the US population, but because we think there's something special about metropolitan areas in terms of their role in generating innovation and economic prosperity. And that idea is not a new one. You can find arguments about the importance of urban agglomerations and cities in terms of supporting economic growth in the writings of Plato and Adam Smith. The general channel that it's thought to operate through is that urban areas foster specialization and trade, and that makes workers more productive, allows them to go deeper in terms of the knowledge they can acquire and apply. And so this evening, I think it's appropriate that we're going to be talking about one of the most, arguably the most specialized group of workers in the economy, STEM workers. Perhaps no other group of workers is responsible for such arcane knowledge and in fields that are often considered esoteric. But as I'll argue throughout this talk, there's good reason why federal policy officials, why Republicans and Democrats alike, why Mitt Romney and Barack Obama all seem to agree that the country needs to bolster its supply of STEM workers. And so let me just go through how the talk will proceed. I'll start with what I'm going to call the conventional view of the STEM economy. And so there it's really about innovation and its importance to the national economy. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what I think might be some flaws with the conventional view for introducing a new definition that I've put out in a recent report. And that takes me to what I'm calling the hidden STEM economy, which is this large group of workers that aren't typically considered part of the STEM labor force, often blue-collar workers, but yet are responsible for very high levels of knowledge in science and technical fields. And by the way, half of STEM workers are in occupations that don't require a bachelor's degree. And that's very much at odds with the conventional view. So with that in mind, I'll then turn to how some of these statistics play out in the Las Vegas and Nevada region, and then discuss a little bit about some policies that could boost both the supply and demand for STEM workers in regions like Las Vegas. So I think the conventional view is very nicely summarized by someone named Vannevar Bush, who is credited as the founder of the National Science Foundation. And he wrote a report to President Roosevelt in 1945 called Science, the Endless Frontier. And there he was very clear about the importance of the STEM labor force in, as he put it, turning the wheels of private and public enterprise, and emphasized that there must be plenty of men and women trained in science and technology, for upon them depend both the creation of new knowledge and its application to practical purposes. So I think the neat thing about this quote is that he seems very much aware that new ideas, new inventions, scientific discoveries are very important to economic growth, but also the application of those ideas matters a great deal. And I think that gets a little bit closer to this hidden STEM economy that I'll be talking about later. So in making the case that STEM knowledge is particularly important to economic growth, there are a number of different approaches that one could take. Macroeconomists have kind of backed out a contribution of innovation to GDP by controlling for things that are easier to measure, like spending on machines and capital equipment and education. But here's just a very straightforward way of appreciating the role of STEM knowledge in economic growth. If you rank every sector of the economy by its contribution to GDP from 1980 to 2012, you'll see that the real estate sector, the financial sector, education and healthcare all made large contributions to GDP. But there's a small group of industries that you could call the high-tech sector. These would be industries like pharmaceutical manufacturing, computer electronics manufacturing, data hosting and processing, information telecommunications related companies, as well as professional services like R&D and computer and information services. So this fairly small group of industries, which constitute just 4% of GDP in 1980, was generating 10% of GDP by 2012 and was responsible for 15% of the net change in GDP, more than any other sector of the economy. And those high-tech industries are the ones that are turning out the most patents. They're the ones that rely the most on STEM-educated workers. And you can see, if you ask the question, well, who are the workers that are coming up with the new inventions? Who are the workers that are coming up with the new companies and founding the new companies that are driving this economic growth? Disproportionately, it's workers with at least a bachelor's of science degree, or at least a bachelor's degree in a science or technical field. So 88% of inventors, according to one survey from Georgia Tech researchers, have a bachelor's degree or higher in a STEM field. And even the majority of tech company founders are educated with a bachelor's degree or higher in a STEM field. You can think of Jeff Bezos of Amazon, or the Google founders who had PhDs in computer science from Stanford. And that compares to just 10% of the population. So obviously they're playing a disproportionate role in invention and entrepreneurship. And then at the same time, the personal returns to STEM knowledge have been increasing dramatically over the last 60 years. So not only are these workers generating new ideas and companies that are driving national economic growth, they're personally benefiting in a really big way. And there's something called the bachelor's degree premium that labor economists talk a lot about, and that's famously gone up quite a bit. If you compare the average wages of folks with a bachelor's degree to those with a high school diploma, the advantage for the bachelor's folks has gone from just under 20% in 1950 to 60% in recent years. But if you do a similar exercise and you compare workers in STEM occupations to workers outside of STEM occupations, you also see a huge increase in the premium, going from roughly 30% in 1950 to 90% in recent years. And so the market is really signaling that these workers are in high demand and are contributing a great deal to the economy. And one of the issues that is responsible for this very high premium is that there seems to be a shortage of these types of workers, at least in terms of the number of people coming out of U.S. universities and colleges with the appropriate skill set. So if you add up all the bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD graduates in a given year in computer science, you have about 108,000. And that compares to about 2.8 million job openings that I estimate for 2013 using data from the Conference Board's job vacancy data. And so there's just an enormous gap between the supply of new entrants into the labor force and the actual demand. And it's similar even for, I mean, it's also large for fields like engineering. It's not quite as large in fields like business and finance, but there's still a gap there too. So that's all consistent with what I'm saying is the conventional view of STEM. The returns are high, the contribution to innovation is large and important. But if you look at actual change in employment by education over the last 30 years, there's something that I think is missing from this story, which emphasizes only the importance of bachelor's degrees, and that's the importance of post-secondary education below the bachelor's level. So that would be associate's degrees and certifications. There's also been a considerable increase in demand for these workers. So these data that I'm showing you here are the growth rates in employment by educational attainment level in different sectors of the economy, the US economy as a whole, the tech sector there in the middle, and the manufacturing sector on the right-hand bar. And it's no surprise to people, I think, to learn that growth for high school or less has been negative in a big way for the manufacturing sector. And this corresponds to about 11 million jobs lost from 1980 to 2011 in the manufacturing sector for workers with a high school diploma or less. I think what's more surprising is that there's actually been a net increase in the number of jobs held by those with some college in the manufacturing sector. It's a very small increase, it's not even 1%. But then if you look at the high-tech sector, those high-tech industries I showed you earlier, there's a larger growth rate in that sub-college employment. And then in the overall economy, there's been somewhat healthier 2% annual growth. So the market is showing us that there's something valuable about this group of workers that are getting associate's degrees, that are getting certifications. And so we need a story that can accommodate their importance to the economy when thinking about STEM skills. And so that takes me to the current definition of the STEM labor force as it's been done by organizations like the National Science Foundation, the Department of Commerce. So there are a number of problems, I think, with this conventional definition. One is that there's not really any firm definition at all. There's not even agreement among federal agencies. There's some disputes about which occupations are included. The different agencies take slightly different approaches. The main consensus seems to be that only professional workers are included, and a very narrow range of professional workers, and I'll go into more detail later. The standards come across as quite arbitrary in that they don't seem to be based on knowledge or skill requirements, because doctors are not included under the conventional definition of STEM workers. And I think we could probably all agree that to be a doctor, you need to know something at least about biology. And nor does the definition seem to be based on some kind of research and development capacity or activity, which I know is a huge emphasis in the National Science Foundation. But the fact is they include just about every sort of IT worker, from somebody working at the help desk who can answer questions about how to use Microsoft Word to computer scientists. And clearly many of those IT staff folks are doing valuable work, but they're not doing research and development activity. They're not patenting new inventions, so that can't be the standard. And there seems to be something of a class bias in some of this, and that consider computer machine programmers. These are jobs that are usually done at factories. The workers need to have a mastery of a fairly arcane programming language in order to run and operate a machine. They need to have some mastery of fields like electronics, physics, and engineering. And yet they're not considered part of the STEM labor force under any of the conventional definitions. Though someone with IT skills of any kind working in an office environment in a professional setting is considered part of the STEM labor force, which seems strange. So to me, the cure is this new database. Well, it's not that new, but it's underutilized, called ONET. And it's the richest, most comprehensive database of job attributes that I've ever seen, and that, to my knowledge, exists in that it has detailed information on the educational requirements, the training requirements, the knowledge, skills, even the tools and technologies that every worker by occupation needs to use as part of their job. It's a Department of Labor funded collection program. It's designed by industrial psychologists, and I think that's one of the reasons that labor economists have ignored it largely. There's recently been some very compelling and I think powerful work by labor economists like David Autor at MIT that have used ONET, but with that exception, it really hasn't become a mainstream part of economic analysis, and I think that's a shame, because it can lead to some real insights, as I hope to convince you. So in terms of how I'm using it in my research, I'm focusing on one aspect of the ONET surveys, that is their knowledge survey. They ask workers in every occupation. They do a random sample of workers in every occupation in the economy. And there are about 800 of them, by the way, different occupational categories. They ask them questions like, how much knowledge of computer and electronics do you need to do your job? And they ask you to rate yourself on a 1 to 7 scale. And so to take the computer electronics example, if all you need to know is how to operate something as basic as a VCR, you'd score a 1. The lowest score. If you are responsible for using a word processing software of some kind, Microsoft Suite, you could rate as high as 3, so that could be an administrative assistant. To get a 6, you need to do something as sophisticated as creating a program to scan computer disks for viruses. And so you can imagine a 7 would have to be extremely advanced, probably doing fundamental research in computer science fields, developing new programming languages, things along those lines. So similar questionnaires are given out in 33 different knowledge domains to workers in these surveys. The ones that I'm focusing on as the core STEM knowledge domain set would be physics, chemistry, and biology under the sciences, and of course, computers, engineering, and math. And from this, you can create a new definition of the STEM labor force by using these data. And I think it has a number of advantages over the conventional definition. One is that you can put together a fairly straightforward way of deciding what a STEM job is and isn't. The way that I've defined it is a STEM occupation is one that requires an extraordinary level of knowledge in one or more of these core STEM fields. And by extraordinary, I used an arbitrary cutoff of 1.5 standard deviations. But as I'll show you, you can relax that assumption, and you can use the underlying knowledge score and do some interesting analysis. So another advantage of using these ONET data is that as a researcher, I don't have to guess, or I don't have to use my imagination to try to guess what sorts of knowledge that workers need out in the economy. The survey asks workers themselves these questions, and in that sense, there's no preconceived bias. There's a self-correcting element to it, in that if an occupation changes in its skill requirements, the data set will be updated every year as they go through and do the next round of surveying. And the other interesting thing is that it brings comparability to other knowledge domains. So as I mentioned, there are 33 different knowledge domains that they survey. So you can use this information to ask questions like, what's the return to knowledge of law, of management, of economics, of English, and how does that compare to engineering, math, and so on. And then if you use these data and you rank all 800 occupations in the economy, you can get a fairly interesting set of rankings where at the very top you get biomedical engineers, as if you pull together the STEM score across these 6 domains. And that's the closest image I could find to represent engineers. They're at the top. And then at the bottom, the least STEM occupation of the economy is fashion models. So there at the bottom, we've got the fashion models image. So you can imagine, to work as a fashion model, you don't need to know a lot about biology or physics. I think we know the attributes that they're looking for there. So if you're thinking about which of these groups would meet my definition for being requiring extraordinary knowledge, is people where that bar is, and that sort of upper part of the graph there. And so what happens when you aggregate all these occupational level data to the US economy and compare it to the conventional definitions of STEM? What you find is that the share of US jobs that you consider STEM jobs goes from 5% using the NSF definition to 20% using this Brookings definition. The percentage of those STEM jobs that require less than a bachelor's degree goes from 19% in the NSF definition to 50% in the Brookings definition. So it's really a massive number of occupations that end up being included here. And you might think, well, does that STEM premium apply when you expand the number of jobs to such a large number? And the answer is yes. And if you compare the STEM premium to other knowledge domains, it really does stand out. So this is representing a regression analysis where a standard deviation change in the level of in the knowledge score of any of these domains is reflected with the dollar amount. So to interpret this, a standard deviation in STEM knowledge is worth $10,000 a year in annual salary, and that compares to $8,000 for a standard deviation in management knowledge. And if you combine the two, you can get very large increases in your salary. So that takes me to what I'm calling the hidden STEM economy, these kind of unheralded, mostly blue collar, but also healthcare related jobs. And if we think about these sub-bachelor's degree but highly skilled jobs, one way to put this in perspective is to think about their role in US economic history. And there's a lot of literature, a lot of really interesting literature on who were the major inventors during the Industrial Revolution and who were coming up with the most important technologies that were driving economic prosperity and economic growth. And it turns out it wasn't the professional scientists that were coming up with most of the inventions. In fact, the single occupation that was responsible for the most patents during the Industrial Revolution was machinists. And if you go down the list and you aggregate these sorts of data, it's really the sub-BA STEM workers that were driving the Industrial Revolution. And that seemed to hold up until sometime around the 1950s. There was a economic journal article by a prominent economist as late as 1957, and he was arguing that these sub-BA STEM workers are playing an important, these blue-collar workers are playing a very important part in U.S. invention and innovation. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, nowadays it seems like things have changed. So most of the inventors filing patents nowadays have a bachelor's of science degree or higher. Many have PhDs. But that doesn't mean that the sub-BA or blue-collar STEM workers are not contributing to innovation. There's some really compelling research summarized by the Australian scholar Philip Toner that shows that if you compare manufacturing plants, the plants that have a larger percentage of their workforce in this kind of skilled sub-BA field have a number of better outcomes when you look at things like product defects, the capacity utilization of the equipment, and just overall measures of efficiency of the manufacturing plant. And there's also evidence from his research that professional scientists and inventors rely on the sub-BA technicians for advice on how to design their products, what materials to use, the practical aspects of invention. And so they're really playing an important complementary role in the process of creating and implementing new ideas and advances. And then if you just step away and look at the broader structure of occupations nationally and rank the major occupational categories by STEM, by the STEM score, you see that the conventional occupations, the three conventional occupations are highlighted in bold here. That'd be architecture and engineering, the sciences, and computer and math. They are in fact very high STEM occupations, as you'd expect. But you also see a number of other occupations that are typically not considered STEM at all, very close to the top of the list. So that would be your healthcare practitioners and technicians, which include nurses. It would include installation, maintenance, and repair workers. These workers are prevalent in a number of different industries. And even construction and extraction workers. So 40% of construction and extraction jobs require high-level STEM skills. And it's particularly true in the extraction side of things. So if you think about the workers who are drilling wells to get to shale gas, they are responsible for a great deal of engineering knowledge, for example. And so there's really a much more diverse set of occupations that make it to the top of this list when you use this sort of method. And you see that 22% of STEM occupations are in healthcare, and 10% are in installation, maintenance, and repair. So these are big numbers. And then if you look at the skill premium and how it varies by bachelor's and higher or sub-BA, you see that it's very comparable. So the sub-BA STEM workers earn about 10% more than other workers in occupations that require the same level of education, but are not STEM. And that compares to 14% for those with a bachelor's degree or higher. So there's evidence that these jobs are in fact in high demand. The average wage, by the way, for these sub-BA STEM occupations is $53,000 a year. And that compares to just $33,000 a year for other occupations that require less than a bachelor's degree outside of STEM fields. And the other way to look at this is in terms of the relative supply and demand of these sorts of workers is how hard it is to fill these jobs. You hear anecdotal evidence and some survey data of employers saying that they have a hard time finding STEM workers, and some reports even call out these sub-BA installation, maintenance, repair workers as being particularly hard jobs to fill. And there's some evidence of that if you look at job openings data. These data come from the Conference Board, which releases data that collects all online advertised job vacancies and classifies them by occupation. And there's one sort of interesting way to try to get at whether or not these jobs are hard to fill, and that's whether or not the jobs are reposted after 30 days. And the percentage of jobs that are reposted, which presumably means there's some difficulty filling them, and there's some evidence to suggest that that's the case. The set of occupations that seem to be the hardest to fill by that measure are the STEM BA jobs, but not far down the list are these sub-BA STEM jobs. And then at the very bottom are the non-STEM sub-BA jobs, which are seem to be much easier to fill. Then another way to look at this, look at the demand for these sub-BA STEM workers and their contribution to innovation is just to observe that they constitute a large fraction of the high-tech industry workforce, so 13% in 2011. And that's a growing percentage. So in 1950, workers with some college but no bachelor's degree were just 1% of the high-tech industry workforce. And by the way, the bachelor's degree STEM workers were only 1% of the high-tech workforce, whereas the high school or less played a much bigger role in 1950. But over the last 60 years, the demand for both BA and higher STEM workers and these sub-BA STEM workers has increased rather dramatically. And now roughly 50% of all high-tech industry workers are in STEM occupations with a large share in the sub-BA category. And then if you look at how this plays out on the metro scale, which is of particular interest to me and my colleagues at the metro program, we find that metro areas with a larger percentage of STEM workers are better off on a number of measures of economic performance. So the metro areas are richer overall in that they have higher GDP per capita, they have higher median household incomes, they have higher wages. They're more innovative in that they have higher patents per capita or patents per worker. They're more export-oriented in that they have a larger concentration of industries that do exporting. They're more resilient to economic downturn in that their job growth has been stronger over the last few years or over the recent recession and recovery. And they employ a larger share of their workers. Their unemployment rates are lower. And these are just correlations. To be fair, there's no way to really prove that it's the STEM component that is causing this, but these findings are robust to controlling for the education of the area, the housing prices of the area, to sort of compensate for the wage effect and the population size. So there does seem to be, at the metro scale, some really important benefits of having a STEM-oriented labor force. And so that takes me to where Las Vegas fits in to all this. And I don't think it's going to surprise too many of you that Nevada as a state ranks 50th on the percentage of its workers that are in STEM occupations. And if you look at Las Vegas metropolitan area, it ranks fairly close to the bottom on most of these metrics. So on patents per worker, which is where it does the best out of these, it's 215th out of about 360. Its growth rate and productivity has been fairly low over the last 30 years. Its bachelor's degree attainment rate in STEM fields is rather low. Even the unemployment rate has been fairly high over the last 20 years. particularly because of the most recent recession, of course. And then more directly, the STEM knowledge embodied in the average worker, the average occupation is particularly low. And unfortunately, the trend from 2007 to 2011 has also been rather bad for the region. So there are certainly some challenges for the region in terms of any efforts to become more STEM oriented. With all that said, there are still 100,000 jobs in the Las Vegas metropolitan area that are high STEM jobs. And that's roughly 13% of the workforce. So it's not that the STEM economy is trivial here. It's actually playing an important role already, despite the low ranking of the metropolitan area. And if you look at the average wages of these workers in Las Vegas, it's $71,759, about $72,000 for the average STEM worker. And then even the sub-BA STEM workers have fairly high wages, about $59,000. And that compares to just $32,000 for sub-BA workers outside of STEM occupations. And this slide, by the way, is available on the Brookings website. We generated profiles as part of this hidden STEM economy report that I did for all the 100 largest metropolitan areas. And there's plenty more data for those so inclined. And so the interesting thing about Las Vegas is that if you look at the wage premium for STEM workers, it's extraordinarily high compared to the average metropolitan area. So there's some evidence that employers are almost desperate for some of these workers, and they're willing to pay them extra money to relocate here from other places, or otherwise do what they can to get them here. And this premium is particularly large for the sub-BA workers. And if you think about some of the reasons why the Las Vegas metropolitan area is not particularly STEM oriented, it's obvious to everyone here that the massive and vibrant tourism economy is a major reason. If you just look across major occupational groups, roughly 16% of all workers in the Las Vegas economy are in food prep and serving occupations, which is one of the lowest on the STEM score. So that's great for my wife and I. When we come visit here, we get to go to top-notch restaurants, and we have hundreds of different choices. But it comes at a cost of having lower percentage of workers in these high-wage STEM occupations. So it's particularly apparent looking at healthcare practitioner occupations and IT-related occupations. And just to play this out, the industries in Las Vegas that do employ the largest share of STEM workers, because after all, as I mentioned, there are 100,000 jobs total, are industries like construction and hospitals, professional, scientific, and technical services. So the way to read this, the number of jobs in this column here is the total number of jobs in the industry in 2011. And if you want to know the number of STEM workers, you'd multiply that by the percentage of workers in STEM occupations. So it's 42% in the Las Vegas area for construction, 62% in hospitals, and 54% in repair and maintenance industry. And the interesting thing there is that 95% of the repair and maintenance jobs don't require a bachelor's degree. And then if you look at the industries in Las Vegas that are the most STEM oriented and that they have the highest percentage of workers in the STEM labor force, or the highest average STEM score per worker, it's data processing, hosting, and related services. So that would be companies like Switch, with 73% of the workers in STEM occupations, very high average salaries. But a surprisingly high number of those jobs don't require a bachelor's degree, or are done by workers that don't have a bachelor's degree. Other industries that are particularly STEM oriented in this region would be the energy related industries, mining, utilities, and as well as construction. So with that, let me turn to some policy ideas on how to boost STEM knowledge, how to boost both the supply and demand of STEM workers. If I were giving this talk in a place like San Jose, or a place with extraordinarily high bachelor's degree attainment rates or extremely high demand for STEM workers, I would focus more on the supply side. But I think here in Las Vegas, given the industry structure and given also the fairly low STEM educational attainment rates, it makes sense to talk about both the supply and demand side. So on the demand side, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the Metro program at Brookings is the importance of clusters. And obviously the Las Vegas area has a world-class tourism cluster already. But I think the emphasis here would be on growing STEM industries and trying to support a cluster strategy around here. So clusters are groups of related companies, often in the same industry, but also in different industries that trade with one another. And the way that we think about it in the Metro program is that one shouldn't use the government to subsidize or these sorts of industries or pick winners in any kind of way, but really to focus on providing the basic public goods that are particularly relevant for these industries. So the government already has an important role to play in education, and that's something that both political parties can largely agree upon. But at the post-secondary level, what further could be done to provide for the skills that are particularly relevant for STEM industries is a question that local leaders I know are asking and could address. And so, a big part of that would be looking at the community colleges and to what extent they're partnering with local businesses and industries to try to tailor their curriculum to match what is needed in the region. And then some other policies at this cluster level could focus on trying to plug gaps in finance, and that could be at any stage of the process. It could be at the research and development stage, so a number of states have research and development tax credits that go on top of the federal R&D credit to try to further incentivize that sort of activity, which could lead to the creation of new businesses and particularly high-tech startups. But there's also a need for, in some cases, for the government to intervene and provide some access to financing for later stage growth and development, particularly in places that are far away from venture capital corridors like Boston and San Jose. It can be very hard to get financing to scale up. A lot of banks don't want to take that kind of risk with a new startup or new company. So a number of states have adopted things like venture capital tax credits or even funds that come out of directly from state revenue that go to promising new businesses. So that's one strategy. Getting infrastructure right, of course, is another one. And I know there's some folks I've talked to here are excited about the interstate that would finally connect Phoenix to Las Vegas. That can play a role in attracting STEM industries insofar as it allows them to trade and move people back and forth to another important metropolitan area easier. And then there are things even outside of government policy that can be important here in terms of increasing the demand for STEM skills. So efforts like Tony Hsieh's using kind of private resources or nonprofit resources to foster and encourage entrepreneurship through things like networking or consulting and guiding young companies, helping them connect to potential financial opportunities. And then at the state level, there are things like tax policy that are some levers. Nevada already is probably maximizing its incentives on tax policy. But there are, as I mentioned, other areas where they could, where the state or regional governments could intervene. And then on the supply side, things really, in many cases, need to start with K through 12 education. So it just so happens that a large number of students at the university level drop out of STEM majors after a semester or two once they realize they're getting grades that are much lower than they expected. And one explanation for that is that the training they got at the high school level, or maybe even earlier, was not adequate to make sure that they complete a STEM education. And this works both at the community college level and at the university and higher level. So some solutions that folks are taking to this kind of problem are STEM-targeted magnet schools. And New York City and Chicago have recently partnered with tech companies like IBM and others to design curriculums for magnet schools that will be located in disadvantaged neighborhoods and are already starting to provide some much needed high quality education in math and sciences and even computer related issues. Another approach is done by the Virginia Beach school system. So there their high schools offer up to something like 100 different industry certifications at the high school level, and students can get course credit for completing industry certifications and learning a programming language, learning one of the Microsoft suites, and getting a certification in that. So they come out of high school with work-ready skills in a STEM field that they can translate into further education if they want. And then there are some great nonprofit programs like MESA, which is headquartered in California, that is getting really great results by providing tutoring and immersion experiences to disadvantaged students and to encourage them to complete STEM and succeed in STEM education. And then at the university level and as well as the community college level, there's room to adopt best practices in recruitment and retention. So some of those types of practices include things like a summer bridge program, which can provide some remedial education in math and statistics and other subjects for students that are entering either at the community college or university level. Scholarships obviously can have a big effect, but those are expensive. Lower cost efforts can be things as simple as setting students up with academic mentors, having them get immersed in the lab experience, and partnering with local industries to set up internships. All these types of things have been proven to boost STEM retention and completion. And I think they've been less utilized at the community college scale because most of the funding has gone towards the universities there. But they're relevant, I think, for both levels of institutions. And then, finally, and kind of related to some of these is improving workforce development. And there are a number of institutions in each metropolitan area that are responsible for training workers and making sure they have industry relevant skills. Workforce investment boards do some of this, but community colleges can take a more active role in really developing relationships with local businesses to make sure that their students are aware of job opportunities and that the companies are aware of the skills that their students are obtaining and linked. So I mean, I've already kind of benefited from this myself, and and I've seen other Brookings scholars benefit from kind of internship-related opportunities that the Brookings Mountain West is providing to Brookings DC. So these kinds of things can be done. There's no reason they couldn't be done in engineering, computer science programs. And with that, I'll conclude. I'm going to put my contact information up here and a link to the Hidden STEM Economy report that I've been talking about. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And thank you for your time. I look forward to some questions and discussion.
We've got time for a few questions. Let me remind people who came in late, Jonathan's PowerPoint is up on our Brookings Mountain website, and the lecture will be as well. And the first hand I saw was up back there.
Hey, Jonathan, you've obviously done the study in other areas, and you've compared Nevada to that.
what would you say are some significant things? I mean, you listed a whole bunch of things that could be done. What are significant differences in areas that are successful at that, like Silicon Valley or Phoenix, San Diego, those areas, others in the east, compared to what's happening here? What would we see the most significant difference between those two areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to point to necessarily specific policy interventions. In the case of Silicon Valley, a lot of it was tied to the presence of Stanford and Berkeley as top-notch research organizations, and in some ways there was some happenstance that some of the initial founders of Intel had some connection there and moved out there, and that really sparked some of it. And but having at the aggregate level, there does seem to be a really important correlation between having strong research programs in STEM fields and some of these outcome measures like GDP per worker and patenting rates and bachelor's degree attainment. So I would say that, to the extent that UNLV can continue to invest in its research capacity, that's going to play out well in terms of boosting the region's performance on some of these metrics. I know there's efforts to build a medical school. There's plans to do that. I think that's the kind of thing that could have a big impact.
An issue that I've heard being involved with graduate student government is that with students, we have a high level in Nevada of English language learner students, and especially in Southern Nevada. So we have students that are coming into the science fields and that aren't completely proficient in English, and then when they're adding on, you're learning, scholarly academic type language on top of it, they're having a very hard time reading it. It's not that they don't have an interest in those fields and that they don't necessarily have a talent in those fields, they're having a language barrier. Yeah. So do you know of any models across the country that are doing intervention with language with STEM learners?
I can't say I can think of any off the top of my head that are language-specific interventions, but I think that there's similar models that could be applied to disadvantaged students that have proven very successful, could be also applied to English language learners. And so these would include some of the things I mentioned earlier, like a summer bridge program, and also developing a cohort. There's some evidence that suggests that if you recruit students from disadvantaged backgrounds and get them in, and over the summer introduce them to one another, introduce them to some counselors that can provide some of these kind of helpful services. That kind of bond that they can form with one another, that the tutoring that they can offer one another can be really helpful in boosting retention.
Two questions really. In Phoenix, they have the Mayo Clinic. Now, at one time, I think the Cleveland Clinic was supposed to come here. I'm not sure if they're here or not. What? They're already here. Have they worked with the UNLV? That's one area. And the other area is, I would suspect that the casinos have more detection services than any place in the United States, including military reservations. Is there any way that they could work for cybersecurity to kind of accompany with the university to get a training system there?
Well, to your first question, I have to defer to UNLV administrators and folks who know the university better than I do. To your second question, I think the answer is probably yes. I suspect you're right that there's tremendous demand for kind of cybersecurity related skills among the casinos, and I don't see any theoretical reason why they couldn't partner with the university in some way to develop a relevant curriculum. There may even be some of that happening now that I wouldn't know, but I think that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about in terms of getting productive partnerships with local businesses.
I think Michael might want to address.
Silicon Valley and Boston and other places get high marks for lots of very, very high academic research and lots of STEM jobs. But what places should we look to see who does 2-year and sub bachelor's degree jobs well?
Yeah, one really interesting example I think is the North Carolina community system. community college system, and particularly in the Durham area. And that's kind of also a high-flying tech hub in some ways. But as it happens, there are a lot of technician jobs, these sub-BA STEM jobs in the biotech industry. And they've developed models where the biotech industry will form a partnership with 5 or 6 different community colleges, and they take some of their employees, some of the HR employees, and some retirees maybe even, and help them design the right curriculum and maintain relationships with the student body. And there's some really compelling evidence that the students that are graduating from those programs are getting very high placement rates in the biotech companies and earning good salaries. So I think that sort of model could work really well. Of course, you need an organized industry presence to kind of make it happen. So there needs to be, first of all, the companies here to do it, but also maybe some help from the civil society, nonprofit sector to kind of organize this sort of thing.
I'm working my way across. I don't want to miss anybody. Was there somebody in back? No? Sir?
So the United States has this history of building a strong middle class with sub-BA workers in manufacturing. And so my question is, will the jobs created by STEM employees keep pace with the jobs that are being eliminated by automation? As we start to automate, we start to replace laborers with machines and artificial intelligence and robots, it takes far fewer technicians to maintain that equipment than it does actual laborers. So is it possible to keep pace?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think the answer is probably no when it comes to the high school or less STEM workers, or just high school or less educated workers generally. Those jobs really do seem to be disappearing, and I don't see any reason why they're going to come back, which is unfortunate. But China has millions of these kind of workers in manufacturing plants that can do these routine jobs at a fraction of the wages. It just doesn't make any economic sense for it to be done in the U.S. The interesting thing to me, though, is that even with this some college group, you do see some growth in high-tech manufacturing and even a little bit of growth in general manufacturing. And so I think what's going on is that these manufacturing businesses are shedding the routine work that used to be the bulk of these kind of middle-class jobs you're talking about, and replacing them with machines. But it's harder to replace these skilled workers with machines. You need people who can, first of all, program the machines and make sure that they're working, and you need people to repair them. So I think there will continue to be some demand there. Whether or not it's going to be enough to deal with or reverse the huge trends in income inequality is an open question.
One more question we have time for, please.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, well, great talk, and go Nittany Lions. I graduated from there too. Kind of along that same line too, though, with I know several reports I read from like IEEE and American Physical Society. If you take out, because of the outsourcing, because of the disappearance of some of the conventional manufacturing type of jobs, that most of the non-computer jobs and IT jobs in STEM are in healthcare. There have been several studies along that line, and I guess you saw some of that, but
yeah, I mean, healthcare, I assume it comes about 22% of STEM workers. Yeah. I'm not sure how it was defined in sort of the reports that you mentioned, but certainly that's been a huge source of net job increase over the last few years, because the healthcare sector is one of the few that sort of survived the recession without major job losses, and I think largely because of demographic change, the fact that baby boomers are retiring, the demand for healthcare is going to be high for the foreseeable future. So I mean, that certainly is a strong source of STEM demand, but there's more going on than that, I guess is what I'd say.
I always like to try and get you out of here on time, but Jonathan will be around if you have any unanswered questions for a few minutes, please feel free to talk to him. And I hope we see you next week. We have a somewhat related lecture. We'll bring another Brookings colleague will be here talking about the aspects of academic research, the innovation in scholarship and academic research and its commercialization and how that fits into economic development opportunities. So I hope we can see you then. Thanks again for coming.
Thanks very much.